The key law enforcement statistics that many of us law enforcement trainers had keyed in on over the last decade or so, last 15 years perhaps, has been the fact that most police officers killed in the line of duty had been killed, that 50% had been killed at 5 feet. Okay? 10 feet, if you moved out to 10 feet, that's only a little past 3 yards, 75% of the law enforcement officers killed had been killed at 10 feet. And by the time you got out to 5 to 7 yards, it was the twilight zone. So we focused a lot of our training, and we tried to refocus traditional law enforcement training on these extremely close distances. You know, this one-step distance of 5 feet, that's just a little under 2 yards. You know, that's one step and I can touch you. So that had been the focus of a lot of us that looked at these law enforcement statistics. And we focused on things such as the fact that at those distances, you're going to need to plow into your opponent, deal with your opponent with empty hands. At the same time, you're drawing and shooting from this very close, tight retention position here. So it was this kind of extremely close quarter shooting that became our focus as a result of those statistics. Now, to be fair, those statistics were of the law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. They weren't an analysis of all of the law enforcement gunfights, because we just don't have good data about that. So we didn't really know at what distance officers won their gunfights, although we kind of knew that the longer the distance, the greater the chance the officer had, because, you know, even though most cops aren't the greatest shots in the world, they're typically better trained than the bad guys. So now comes along Tom Givens' data that says his civilian students are actually winning their gunfights very consistently at 5 to 7 yards, which is a much greater distance than we had been training at, this extremely close quarter, you know, kind of 1 yard bad breath distance. What accounts for that? Now, granted, it's not quite apples and oranges. We're comparing law enforcement officers killed versus civilian gunfights won. But let's just sort of wash over that for the time being, and let's just look at the broader question of why civilian gunfights are probably occurring at longer distances than law enforcement gunfights. So that when we get on the range and we start to train, and we choose the techniques and the standards that we're going to train to, that we are focusing on the right problem. Well, the fact is, law enforcement officers have a duty. When the bad thing happens, okay, they show up, they get the call, they show up, they have a duty to intervene. Sometime during that intervention, they have to approach the bad guy. If they've got to eventually put cuffs on them, they've initially got to come out and interview them, they may have to restrain them initially, but it's the law enforcement officer's responsibility to close the distance with the bad guy so that they can do their job, whether that's interviewing, whether it's restraining, whether it's intervening, or even perhaps eventually shooting. So it's because they have to get close to their assailant that probably accounts for the fact that law enforcement officers tend to get into gunfights. We certainly know they get killed at closer distances than civilians. What accounts for the fact that civilian gunfights occur at these kind of nice traditional training distances of between 3 and 7 yards? I mean, 7 yards is where an awful lot of training takes place. That's two car lengths of distance. Well, and it's Tom Givens that points this out. He said, think of how those situations occur. What causes them to happen? What causes them to happen is typically an armed robbery. The bad guy uses their gun the way it was intended as a standoff weapon. They approach their target, their victim, and they don't get right up close before they try to rob them. They stand back away, like any intelligent person would, and challenge the person, say, give me your money, give me your wallet, whatever. They aren't right on top of the people when they challenge them. So that's what occurs for the fact that these fights occur at longer distances, because criminals choose not to engage citizens right up close. And if you think about it, if you were a criminal and you wanted to routinely get people's money from them, you wouldn't be right in their face either. If you had a gun, you would use the standoff distance, which is what the gun is intended to do. So that's the reason. The reason civilians get into gunfights and win them, if they are trained properly, is because criminals are using their guns, the way the gun was intended to be used. So when we get out on the range, we're going to spend a lot of time training at those distances, 3 to 7 yards, certainly beyond as well, but that is going to be the focus of our training. That is the traditional focus of training, and that's one of the interesting things about this experience of Tom Givens going public with his data, is the fact that we are now coming back around to some very traditional training, and not just out of fashion, not just because everything goes in cycles, but because we now have the data that supports it.